When Lada Veres returned to the forgotten village of Drowned Hollow, nestled deep in the woods of western Ukraine, the rain greeted her first. It wasn't a gentle rain, but a thin, icy drizzle that soaked into her bones and whispered warnings only the trees could hear. 20 years had passed since her brother Ostap vanished in these woods, 8 years old and smiling, heading toward the lake with his fishing rod and whistling a song she'd long forgotten. He never returned. The villagers said he must have drowned. But Lada remembered the stories. Whispers in the schoolyard, hushed warnings from toothless elders. The lake gives, the lake takes. But it never forgets. She never believed them. Not really. Not until she came back. The house of her grandfather Kuzo stood at the edge of the village like a rotting monument. Half swallowed by ivy, roof sagging, the front door creaked open with a sound like a dying breath. Inside, it smelled of mildew, ash, and old books, just as she remembered. On the dusty kitchen table sat a rusted keyring shaped like a mermaid. It was absurdly familiar. She picked it up, and something fluttered to the ground, a brittle piece of paper, yellowed with age. On it, scrawled in trembling handwriting, were just 3 words. Seek beneath water. That night, sleep came in fragments. The wind howled like wolves, and the walls groaned with age. At 3:17 a.m., she woke to a sound. Dripping, but it wasn't coming from the roof. It was beneath the floorboards. Holding her breath, she listened. There it was again, not just dripping, whispering. Faint, watery voices, gurgling in a forgotten language. Then her name, Lada, soft, intimate, like a secret. She sat up in bed, every nerve lit with dread. The air was damp, heavy. She turned on her phone's flashlight and swung her legs over the side of the bed. Her bare feet touched something cold. Water, just a thin film, but enough to ripple when she moved. She checked the pipes. Nothing, no leak. When she returned to bed, something had changed. The blanket was wet, not soaked, just damp, like someone had been lying there beside her. Someone still dripping from the lake. The next day, she returned to the lake. It hadn't changed. The same sickle-shaped curve, the same black surface that reflected nothing. It looked thick, almost solid, the kind of water that swallowed light. She knelt by the edge, heart pounding. From her pocket, she pulled a small flat stone. Gray, with a white streak, the same kind she and Ostap used to trade after each fishing trip. She tossed it into the lake. It didn't sink. The stone rested on the surface for a second. Then, as though caught by unseen hands, it slid downward, not sinking, but vanishing. Drawn into the water's skin like a needle through flesh. The lake burped. A ripple reached the shore. And from the far side of the trees came a distant sound, laughter. Childlike, warped, echoing in a way that made her skin crawl. That night, Lada dreamed she was underwater. Not floating, sinking. Her arms wouldn't move. Her mouth wouldn't open. All around her, the water was not blue, but black, filled with strands of something like hair. Long, pale threads brushed across her skin like fingers. She saw shapes below her. Houses, streets, a whole village, drowned and rotting beneath the surface. And then, she saw faces looking up from windows, watching her fall. Their mouths were open, but no bubbles escaped. Their eyes were too wide, as if waiting for her to join them. Then one of the faces shifted. It was Ostap, still 8 years old, still smiling. He opened his mouth and said something, but it came out as a bubbling scream. His eyes turned black, and Lada woke up choking. She barely touched her coffee the next morning. Her hands were shaking too much. She walked through the village. Most of the homes were empty or collapsed. Windows stared blankly. The old church still stood, its steeple leaning like it had tried to run and been caught mid-step. An old woman sat outside on a bench, peeling apples with a dull knife. Lada recognized her vaguely, Helena, a neighbor from long ago. Helena didn't smile when she saw her. Just stared with pale, foggy eyes. "You shouldn't have come back," she rasped. "I just want to know what happened to my brother," Lada said, barely above a whisper. Helena's knife paused mid-slice. "The lake took him. That's what everyone says. But no one says why." Helena looked past her, toward the forest, toward the water. "Because we made a deal," she said finally. "A long time ago. Something needed feeding, and we fed it." Lada's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean?" But Helena didn't answer. She tossed the apple peel into the grass, stood, and shuffled back inside her crumbling house, slamming the door behind her. That evening, Lada sat alone by the lake again. The surface was still, unnaturally so. Like glass poured over a corpse. She saw her reflection, but it wasn't hers. The woman staring back had her face, but her eyes were wrong, wide, black, and dripping. She backed away, heart racing, and turned to leave. But something caught her attention. On the old wooden pier, half buried in reeds, was a small bundle wrapped in canvas. She pulled it out with trembling hands. Inside was a child's shoe. Faded, torn, covered in moss, and sewn into the sole, half rotted but legible, were 3 letters. O.V. Lada Veres. Her stomach turned. That night, she couldn't sleep. The whispering returned, louder this time. More urgent. Beneath her floorboards. In the drains. Even inside her pillow, as if it were soaked with voices. Then the lights flickered and died. And in the darkness, a voice spoke clear and wet. We never wanted you. We wanted him. Lada didn't sleep the rest of the night. When the sun finally rose, pale, diluted, barely more than a sickly glow, she left the house. The lake was quiet, too. Quiet. Even the birds had stopped singing. She went back to the old church. Its doors hung crooked, warped from rain and time. The air inside smelled of mildew, incense, and something older. Something that shouldn't still breathe. She made her way to the altar. There, carved beneath the wooden cross, was a strange sigil. 3 concentric circles, interlocked like a knot. It pulsed faintly beneath the dust, as though it had been recently traced by a wet finger. And pinned to the altar with a rusted nail was a photograph. She picked it up carefully. It was old, sepia-toned, blurred from moisture, but she could still see their faces. Her grandfather Kuzo, younger and rigid, standing with a group of men at the lakeshore. All of them held torches. Behind them, a small boat floated on the lake. And inside the boat, tied and blindfolded, was a child. Not Lada. Someone else. A sacrifice. She staggered out of the church, her heart thudding in her ears. Her breath fogged in the cold air, though it wasn't even winter. It felt like the lake was breathing now, slow, ragged exhalations rising from the soil. When she returned to the house, the front door was wide open. Inside, muddy footprints trailed across the floor. Small, bare, child-sized. She followed them. They led into the hallway. To the bathroom. The mirror was fogged, but not from steam. From inside. She wiped it. Her reflection blinked back at her, except it didn't move when she did. Its mouth opened, and out of it came a whisper. He is still down there. And he remembers. That night, the dreams were worse. She stood at the bottom of the lake, surrounded by the drowned. Their skin was waxy, their mouths open. They stared at her with milky eyes, and all began to chant in unison. The pact is broken. A debt remains. She saw her grandfather again, holding something in his hands, a baby, screaming, struggling. He walked into the water. And disappeared. Lada woke gasping. She couldn't stay idle anymore. She grabbed her flashlight, her coat, and a spool of heavy rope. She was going back to the lake. This time, to dive. She didn't care if it was insane. She needed to know. She had to find him. The pier groaned beneath her steps as she lowered herself into the boat left by her grandfather years ago. The wood was slick with moss, but the oars still worked. She rowed out, deeper and deeper, until the water below her felt bottomless. She took a deep breath, tied the rope around her waist, and went in. The cold hit like knives. She sank slowly, her flashlight cutting narrow tunnels through the black. Nothing but mud, murk, algae. Then, shapes. Wooden beams. A rooftop. A bell tower. A village. Beneath the lake, she swam down toward the largest structure, what looked like a town hall. Inside, her flashlight flickered. In the darkness, something moved. She turned. A figure floated before her. Small, childlike. Lada. He opened his mouth, and no air came out. Only silt. But his eyes locked onto hers. He reached toward her. And behind him, the darkness opened wide, revealing a maw, a circle of teeth made of wood, bone, and screaming faces. The lake was not just haunted. It was alive. And it was watching. The maw beneath the lake opened wider, and Lada could feel the pull. It wasn't just physical. It clawed at her thoughts, memories, identity. She gripped the rope around her waist and kicked upward, fighting the current that wasn't water but will. A force trying to keep her, to fold her into the silt with the rest of the forgotten. Lada floated in place, staring at her with that same unreadable expression. Then he mouthed a word. Run. A scream welled in her throat, but no sound passed her lips. She surged upward, heart-pounding. Her flashlight flickered once, twice, and then died. The last thing she saw was a pale, skeletal hand reaching toward her from the darkness below. She broke the surface gasping, coughing out lakewater that tasted of rust and something sweetly rotten. Pulling herself into the boat, she untied the rope and slumped over the edge, trembling. Something had followed her. She could feel it. As she rowed back, every creak of the oars sounded like teeth grinding. She didn't speak when she returned home. She didn't sleep. Instead, she opened her grandfather's chest, the one he kept locked until the day he died. Inside were notebooks, journal entries, drawings, and names. So many names. Children. One entry, dated 1963. The pact is old, older than the lake. The drowned god needs memory. It feeds on what is forgotten. We give it those who have no one left, or those we promise it. That's the only way to keep the village from sinking. Another entry. Ostap was never meant to be chosen. But it knew. It wanted blood tied to me. It wanted punishment. And another, in shaking handwriting. I thought if I gave it myself, it would let him go. But Kuzo never went through with it. The final page had no words. Only a drawing. The sigil of the three rains, burning in black ink. Lada left the house at dawn. She went to Helena's door and pounded on it until the old woman opened, wrapped in a thin shawl, her eyes already red, like she had been waiting. You saw it, Helena said. Not a question. I saw him. The woman lowered her gaze. Then there's still a chance. For what? To bring him back. Lada stared at her. Bring him back? He's been dead for 20 years. Helena's lips thinned. The drowned god doesn't eat the soul. It eats presence. The memory. If enough people remember, it lets go. It can't keep what is bound to this world. So, what do I do? Helena handed her a candle, a jar of salt, and a worn page from an old prayer book. The words were in a dialect she didn't recognize. You go to the center of the lake. At midnight, you speak his name. You speak the names of those it took. You light the candle. You pour the salt. And then, you pray it. Listens. That night, Lada returned to the lake. It was still. Not a ripple. The stars refused to reflect. She rowed to the center, heart a drumbeat of terror. She placed the candle at the edge of the boat and lit it. The flame flickered blue. She opened the salt and let it fall like snow into the water. Then she began to speak. Ostap Veres. She waited. Anichka Polyak. She waited. Ivan Halushko. Marta Dovan. Petro. Mikhailuk. The water began to stir. Then bubble. Then steam. She screamed his name again. Ostap. I remember you. I never forgot. I never. The candle blew out, and something broke the surface. Not a hand. Not a body. A face. Smiling. Alive. Lada froze. The face on the surface of the water was unmistakable. Ostap. Older than when he disappeared. A teenager now. Wet hair clinging to his forehead. Pale lips parted slightly, eyes wide with recognition. But something was wrong. He wasn't breathing. He just stared. His image wavered in the black water, like a fragile reflection. She reached out, fingers trembling, and the moment she touched him, he blinked. A tear slid down his cheek. And then he spoke, but his mouth never moved. The words came through the water, like sound filtered through bone. You remembered. She tried to answer, but her voice cracked. Ostap, you're alive? He blinked slowly. I am kept. By the drowned god? Not a god. A memory that eats. His image flickered, like static. I am not alone. Beneath the boat, the lake began to glow, faintly, blue-green, like swamp fire. Shapes moved beneath the surface. Dozens. Maybe hundreds. Children. Adults. People lost to the village across generations. They were not corpses. They were preserved memories. Their eyes turned to her, and she felt it. Not malice, not hunger. Hope. Suddenly, the boat rocked violently. Water splashed over the sides. A sound rose from the depths. A deep groaning, like the forest itself was wailing. The glow beneath the lake began to spiral, forming a vortex around her boat. From beneath the whirlpool, it rose. Not a creature. Not in the normal sense. A structure. A tower of bone and wood and drowned faces. Arms woven into branches. Eyes peeking from every crack. A shape that shifted depending on how you looked at it. It was memory. Writhing. Weeping. Sentient. The drowned god. It spoke in many voices, all at once, layered over each other. You broke the silence. You called them back. You undo the pact. Lada stood in the boat, screaming above the roar of wind and water, he was never yours. And then she lifted the page Helena gave her. She read the words. Each syllable burned her throat. The boat began to sink. The lake fought her, tried to twist the page from her fingers, but she held tight. She shouted Ostap's name again and again, louder with each breath. The candle lit itself. The salt turned to ash. The lake stilled. The god howled, a noise like hundreds of mouths unhinging in grief. And then, it began to unravel. The vortex collapsed. The light beneath the lake grew brighter. One by one, the glowing shapes rose to the surface like bubbles, drifting skyward and vanishing into the stars. Not bodies, souls, memories released. Lada wept. And there, clinging to the edge of the boat, was Ostap. Not a vision, not an echo. Real, breathing, crying. Lada, he whispered. She pulled him into her arms and held him like the world might end if she let go. They returned to the village at dawn. Helena was waiting by the shore, her hands clasped, tears streaming down her face. Word spread fast. Doors opened. People came out, stunned, trembling. Many wept as if they'd seen ghosts. Some had. Others would, in time. Because the lake had changed. It was no longer black. No longer thick. It reflected again. And in its reflection were faces once lost, lingering, smiling, fading slowly into peace. The village of Drowned Hollow did not speak of the lake for a long time. Not out of fear, but out of reverence. For weeks after the return, the water shimmered at night with faint silver ripples, and those who stood at its edge swore they could hear music, soft, melancholic lullabies that seemed to come from somewhere deep below. Lada stayed. She didn't plan to. She had told herself she would find the truth, bury the ghosts, and leave. But the truth was, the ghosts were not gone. They lived with her now. Inside her, Ostap barely spoke those first few days. He sat at the window of their grandfather's house, staring toward the water. When she asked him what it had been like, he just shook his head. I was there, he said once. But also, not. Like a story someone stopped telling halfway through. When he finally slept, he didn't dream. Or maybe he did, but the lake still held them. Lada found herself walking the forest trails each morning. Something about the air felt lighter now. Less watched. The trees, once hunched and tense, stood straighter. And yet, she knew better than to believe it was over. One evening, as the wind rustled through the reeds, she found something on her doorstep. A stone, flat and gray, with a white streak across it. Just like the ones she and Ostap used to collect. But this one had a symbol scratched into its face. 3 rings. Interlocked. And beneath them, the faint outline of an eye. She went to Helena the next morning. The old woman was dying. She lay in her bed, pale as ash, the life slowly slipping from her like sand through trembling fingers. Lada sat beside her. You knew, she whispered. You always knew. Helena nodded weakly. We all did. We just forgot to remember. What was the drowned god really? Helena looked at her with glassy eyes. It was us. Our guilt. Our silence. The things we threw away instead of facing. It fed on forgetting. So now it's dead? Helena gave a tiny, bitter smile. No, child. Gods like that don't die. They just go hungry. And with that, she passed. Autumn came. Ostap began to draw again. He filled notebook after notebook with the village, the lake, the faces he could remember. But sometimes Lada caught him staring at nothing, listening, as if the lake still whispered. And sometimes, just before dawn, when the fog rolled thick across the ground, she saw something standing at the tree line. Not close, not moving, just waiting. She started writing again, not just in her journal, but everywhere, on scraps of paper, in old books, etched into wood. Names, dates, stories. She wrote every memory she had of the village, every ghost, every sin, because she had learned the truth. To forget is to feed it. And to remember is to hold it at bay. The lake had not been drained. The god had not been slain. The pact had been broken, but the hunger remained. Some nights, when the moon was full and the world was too quiet, she sat beside the water and whispered names into the wind. And from deep below, she sometimes heard a voice answer. Still here. A month passed before Lada heard the whispers again. It was the first frost of the season. The reeds along the lakeshore had turned brittle, and the village had settled into uneasy quiet. Ostap was slowly becoming himself, talking more, helping fix the roof, even laughing once or twice. But something in the air had changed. The water no longer glowed. It had begun to darken again. That morning, a dog was found dead at the lake's edge, eyes wide, ribs cracked inward, as if something had crushed it from within. There were no footprints, no blood, just the dog, twisted and bloated, staring at the sky with foam on its lips. Lada knew the signs. She returned to her grandfather's chest. Among his belongings, she had missed something, a second journal, thinner, hidden beneath a false bottom. Inside it, only one page had writing. A map, and 3 words scrawled in red ink beneath it. Stone sings louder. The map showed the lake, but beneath it, underground tunnels, caves, something old, something buried. She showed it to Ostap. He went pale. I dreamed of that place, he said. When I was down there, I didn't know it was real. You were never just under the water, Lada whispered. Ostap shook his head. No, I was beneath it, far beneath, with others, kept in a place where the drowned god thinks. That night, they made a plan. With headlamps, rope, and a growing sense of dread, they followed the old path marked on the map, around the lake's southern curve, past the ruined chapel, into the base of the hill locals once called Dead Man's Hollow. No one ever went there. Now she knew why. The entrance was narrow, just a crack in the rock, veiled in brambles. But the cold air that seeped from within smelled of salt, stone, and something decayed. They crawled inside, brushing away centuries of dust and spiderweb. The tunnel sloped downward fast. Soon they were underground, the light from outside nothing more than a memory. The silence was total. No echoes, no dripping, as if sound itself had been buried. And then, after what felt like hours of descent, they reached it. A vast subterranean hall, carved from obsidian and ancient limestone. Markings covered the walls, symbols older than Cyrillic, more primal. A language of water and grief. At the center, a massive stone monolith. The same 3-ring sigil was carved into it, pulsing faintly with blue light. And kneeling before it, a man, or what was once a man. He turned. His face was bone, stretched with old skin. Eyes black, lips stitched shut with rusted wire. But his mind spoke. You opened the lake. You broke the veil. Lada stepped forward, trembling. What are you? The thing stood. I am the one who remembered too much. Lada's breath caught in her throat. The stitched-faced figure stood unnaturally still. No breath, no twitch, no blink, but his thoughts pushed against hers like a tide pressing through her skull. I held the stories. I guarded the boundary. Until it broke. She wanted to speak, but her voice wouldn't work. Not here. The air was too thick, too damp with memory. Beside her, Ostap trembled. I've seen him, he whispered. In dreams. He was always standing behind the door. The stitched man turned to face Ostap. You were never meant to escape. The lake does not forget its offerings. Lada stepped forward. Why are you down here? The voice surged into her bones. Because I chose to carry the truth, when others ran. I kept the weight, and now you've disturbed the stone. He pointed to the monolith behind him, its glowing symbols now pulsing faster, like a heartbeat. Something beneath it shifted. A crack formed along its base. Ostap stepped back. It's waking up again. The stitched man bowed his head. You came too deep. It remembers your name now. And it will reach higher. They fled, up through the tunnels, past the trembling walls. At one point, they heard something howling in the dark, a sound like 1,000 children weeping through a pipe. They didn't stop to look. Outside, dawn had begun to paint the sky gray. But the lake was boiling. Pockets of steam rose from its surface. Fish floated belly up near the shore, dead and eyeless. Back in the village, people stood in doorways, silent, watching the water. And from the woods, something watched back. That night, Lada sat with Ostap, hands wrapped tight around mugs of bitter tea. Neither of them could speak for long. Finally, she said, we didn't end it. We just woke it. Ostap nodded. It didn't want me. It wants you now. Because you remember too much. Lada's stomach twisted. Because deep down, she knew he was right. She dreamed again that night. She stood in the underground hall, alone. The stitched man was gone. The monolith had split open. Inside it was not stone, but flesh. Beating, glowing, and from within it crawled the first victim. A child made of water and grief, whispering words in a voice that sounded like her own. You're not done yet. At sunrise, a crow landed on her windowsill. Its wings were soaked, dripping onto the wood. It dropped something. A tooth. Small. Human. The tooth lay on the windowsill like an accusation. Lada picked it up with shaking fingers. It was cold. Too cold. And smooth, as if it had never belonged to something alive. A symbol was etched into the root. A single eye. Open. Watching. She wrapped it in cloth and placed it in the drawer beside her bed. But it didn't stay there. When she woke again, it was on her pillow. The lake was rising. Each day, a little more. Inch by inch, it crept up the shore, swallowing reeds and trees and memories. Villagers noticed. Some packed bags. Some prayed. Others said nothing at all. Because they'd seen it too. The faces. Reflected in windows. Appearing in puddles. Watching from within the mirrors that no longer showed their own. The drowned were returning. Not to haunt. To reclaim. Ostap began to change. He walked slower. Spoke less. His skin turned pale, even in sunlight. One night, Lada found him standing ankle-deep in the lake, fully dressed, eyes closed, arms limp at his sides. Ostap. He didn't answer. She waded in and grabbed his shoulders. Wake up. His eyes opened, pitch black. They're calling, he said softly. They say I left something behind. A piece of me. They want it back. Lada carried him home, sobbing, terrified. She boiled herbs, burned sage. She called priests, begged for answers. But none would come to Drowned Hollow anymore. Only one person remained who might know what to do. The stitched man beneath the earth. She returned to the tunnels alone. The stone path was colder now. It wept condensation like tears. The deeper she descended, the more distorted her thoughts became. Time-twisted, thoughts bled together. When she reached the chamber, the monolith was gone. Only water remained, and in it, rising slowly, the stitched man. His wires had broken. His mouth was open, and from it poured a flood of names. Thousands of them. Every soul the lake had taken. And Lada's was among them. You were marked the moment you remembered, he said aloud. No longer just a voice in her head. But I'm not part of it, she pleaded. You are now. He pointed at her chest. And she saw it. Burned into her skin, just beneath her collarbone. The three-ring sigil. The drowned god is no longer bound to the lake, he whispered. It moves. Through memory. Through story. Through you. That night, the lake flooded its banks. The villagers fled. The woods whispered. And Lada sat beside her brother, who now whispered in his sleep in a voice not his own. She wept. Not for what she had lost. But for what she was becoming. The village of Drowned Hollow stood half submerged. The lake, once still and secretive, now churned with purpose. Houses collapsed into it. Trees bent toward it, as if paying reverence. And above it all, the air. Pulsed with the sound of voices, not screaming, not crying. Chanting. Lada stood at the edge, the water licking her boots. Ostap behind her, silent, thin, barely holding on. His eyes had gone black entirely, and his shadow no longer matched his body. It rippled differently. Too slow. She knew he didn't have much time. And she knew what she had to do. The stitched man's warning rang in her mind. The god is no longer contained. It lives in those who remember. In those who carry grief like a relic. It will wear you next. The only way to stop it was to be forgotten. She prepared the ritual on the pier where Ostap had vanished 2 decades ago. Salt in a circle. 3 stones stacked in the shape of the sigil. And in the center, the page from her grandfather's book, the invocation of removal, written in reverse. Ostap sat nearby, his head tilted like he was listening to a song only he could hear. She touched his hand. It was cold, and webbed. The wind picked up as she began to chant. Each line felt like tearing a page from herself. The water roared, the trees bent back, and from the center of the lake, something vast began to rise, not fully formed, not entirely real. A shape of memory and shadow, half human, half history. It had 100 faces and none. It was made of every child, every prayer, every forgotten name. And it was reaching for her. Lada screamed the final line and dropped the tooth the crow had given her into the water. The lake turned black. The god shrieked, not in anger but in mourning. And then everything went still. Time cracked. And broke. When she opened her eyes, she was standing in her grandfather's house. Dusty. Empty. As if nothing had happened. She ran to the lake. It was small now. Peaceful. A pond, really. Barely 10 feet deep. No one remembered Drowned Hollow anymore. The village was no longer on any map. No one remembered Ostap. Not even Ostap. He lived in the city now. 28 years old. working in a bookstore, smiling at customers, living a normal life. They called him Orist now. He didn't remember the lake. Or her. She watched from across the street. And walked away. Lada Veres disappeared that year. Some say she drowned. Some say she left for the Carpathians and never returned. But if you stand by a body of still water, in a place no one visits, and say her name 3 times, sometimes the water will ripple. Sometimes your reflection will blink. And sometimes, a voice will whisper back, I remember.